So this was the last time she was in her home safe. We had been friends since I met her in 3rd grade. Brings back lots of memories. And she didn't know she was what she was gonna have to go.
My sister had been killed, murdered, abducted by somebody we didn't know. The impressions on Carla's neck, where you could tell hands had been around her neck, and she had literally dug her fingernails into her own flesh trying to get those hands off of her. I thought, was she begging for her life?
How did you kill her? I guess choked her.
Knowing that this was the answer that detectives had been looking for the last 46 years. I knew who did this to Carla. And,
So anyway. I loved my father. I still do. Can't stop loving somebody. It haunts me, the thought that my father, which I love so much, could spend an eternity in hell.
Part of my life experience has led me to living with legal blindness. Right here? Okay, thank you. Prognosis is irreversible, and that it will probably only get worse. I miss seeing pictures of my parents, my relatives, my family. So the ones that I can remember are very, very vivid to me. One of my favorite photos that I remember of Carla is that picture of Carla with the hearts, her hair done. I see a girl who's looking at the future, is excited about it, got a life in front of her. Carla was 17 and I was 12. I looked up to Carla. I thought she was beautiful. She was a good student. She was popular. She was a good daughter, good sister. Rodney McCoy was Carla's high school sweetheart. He was just an all-around, all-American boy. Played football for the high school. Rodney would literally light up when he'd see Carla. And Carla would light up when she'd see Rodney. Rodney was a hero to me at that time in my life. High school quarterback, just a nice kid. On that night, Carla and Rodney went out on their Valentine's Day. Pictures were taken and, mom and dad, giving all the advice, be safe, don't drink, y'all have fun, and we'll see you when you get home. And she looked beautiful, just looked like a princess. And they were off, and then the rest of our night was waiting for them to come back to hear about how fun the dance was. It was about 1:45 in the morning, and I heard a car coming up into our front yard. I heard a door screeching open, and I heard Rodney's voice yelling, "Mr. Walker, help me, they've got her. They're gonna hurt her bad, I know they are." Dad immediately started asking him questions, where are y'all at, where's she at? And he's telling her, we're at the parking lot, the west side of the bowling alley. They were kissing. The door jerked open. Rodney said it all happened so quick. According to Rodney, the guy said, "I'm going to kill you," and pointed a gun about 6 inches from Rodney's face. Rodney gets being hit on the back of the head and front of the head, and he's not sure what's going on. He has no idea. And then Carla is being drug out of the car by this person, and Rodney clearly hears this man say to Carla, "You're going with me, aren't you, sweetie?" And he said he remembers looking at Carla, and he said that's the last thing he saw before he passed out. I just knew something had changed. I knew something horrible had changed, and you know, even right now, I start thinking about that. I get teary-eyed, and yeah. So I knew something horrible had happened. I just didn't really have the life experience to comprehend what I was witnessing. But I knew something horrible had happened. And I know my mom and dad had to feel that way.
When I was shown the Carla Walker case files, there were 4 boxes about this size, 4 of them, full of case file information. It was a case that had been worked over the last 46 years. Numerous detectives had worked on it, and they hadn't found resolution. I wanted to start from the very beginning, broke down the case files, and then start reading all the detective notes from day one. Where Rodney had parked his car, they found Carla's purse out on the ground, and they find this magazine from a Mark I Ruger 22. The magazine release on this particular type of weapon is at the bottom of the grip. It's probably bumped, and the magazine fell to the ground. A purse and a magazine. It's not a lot to work with. Back in 1974, Tarrant County Sheriff's Office, the Fort Worth Police Department, Benbrook Police Department all start this search for Carla. And for the next 3 days, the community gets involved in the search. And there were thousands of people that were searching for Carla. I think there were a lot of people that were optimistic that Carla had been being held somewhere and had been kidnapped. So I know there was a lot of optimism and hope that Carla would have been found alive. At the crime scene where Carla was found, it had been very, very cold. She was very well preserved. She still had her dress on. Carla was abducted, sexually assaulted, and choked just shortly after her abduction and after the sexual assault had taken place. The original investigators did a great job of bagging her hands to collect fingernail scrapings. They bagged her dress, her bra, her panties. And that's pretty much the evidence that was found at the culvert where she was recovered. It's just sadness when you see something this horrific, and think about the crime committed that night and the loss that the family experienced. Losing Carla, this was the end of her life. As far as what I felt about the case and who the offender was, it's typically somebody that's close to your victim. So, quite honestly, I felt that it was going to be somebody that knew Carla and was close to Carla. In going through all of the case files, I had actually developed a list of 85 suspects. And this ranged from friends of Carla, ex-boyfriends of Carla, people that had called in. I really did feel, with all of the work that the detectives had done prior to me, that it was solvable. I believed that the information was contained in those case files. It was just going to have to be found.
We drove to the morgue, and this really changed my life. Seeing my mom and dad go in there, and then, you know, I heard my mom scream. It was nothing like I'd ever heard. But when a mom sees a body of her young daughter who had been kidnapped, brutally beaten, raped, her face had bruises all over it, dry blood in her teeth and some of her hair. 30 seconds after that, they were walking out of the door. My dad had his arm wrapped around her, was holding her up. She just cried silently. And it was silent all the way home.
I don't remember crying. I think I was just going through motions. I was just in shock. But it's just like, how could that happen? And that could happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime. And I never felt or heard of anything like that happening. So it was a very scary. Like, that person's out there, he's gonna do it to another one of my friends. That was probably the biggest thing, was the fear that took over. I met her in 3rd grade, and we had been friends ever since. She was just so full of energy and just smiled and got along with everybody. The day of the dance, Carla called me and said, "Hey, I've got to go to Cloth World, and I'm going to bring my dress and find some ribbon to match for the bows of my hair. Do you want to come?" I said, "Yeah." Carla had just gotten a promise ring from Rodney. But I remember the plans being that when she graduated, they were going to go to Texas Tech, and then after they graduated, they were going to get married. I treasure that I got to talk to her before she went to the dance. There was no thinking in my mind that I was never going to talk to her again or see her again. And the funeral was at her church. Everything was such a blur, and I think it probably had to do with being in shock. I didn't want to accept it, but they had an open casket. As I got up to the casket, and I remember I just felt, my body just, I don't know, didn't have any strength anymore, and I passed out. in front of the casket when we walked by. The lady that had been sitting next to me was behind me, and she called me. The funeral made it more real that they really did find her body. She's gone. She's she's not coming back. After the funeral, I was exhausted, and so I got on the couch and laid down. And then the family phone rang in the kitchen. I picked up the phone and they just started breathing real heavy on the phone. They would ask, what size bra do you wear? Have you had sex? What kind of underwear do you wear? And if you don't answer these questions, I'm gonna kill you and or your parents. And I just screamed and hung up the phone. And when my mom came in, I was a bawling basket case. I was very scared. Scared of, was I the next victim? I got phone calls where they would just call and breathe heavy in the phone, like I received the one right the day of the funeral. But then I would get pretty perverted phone calls. They did put a tracer, and I know you had to stay on the line a certain amount of time. It was very terrifying to get those calls because you had already experienced something you never experienced before, and the fear was so real. And so to add horrible calls on top of that, even just the breathing heavy in the phone. Is this the killer? It was just filled of fear of nothing that I'd ever felt before or never will probably feel again. After this happened, nothing was ever the same again. Mr. and Miss Walker were never the same. And they kept Carla alive as much as they could, but they were never the same. Mr. Walker, graduation, he definitely was there taking pictures, making sure he was, congratulating us. When my first child was born, he came up to the hospital, but he came up there and took pictures. Well, it just meant a lot because I wanted Carla there for those things, and she couldn't be. But I also knew how he was crushed, that he missed out with that with Carla, but he was happy to be there with us. So I knew the pain that he was feeling. But it was joy too.
Glenn McCurley was a truck driver at the time of Carla's abduction and killing. He owned the exact same make and model of gun as the magazine that was found at the crime scene where Carla had been abducted. They interviewed him extensively. He was insistent that he did not have this gun, and he said that it had been stolen just a few weeks prior. They asked him why he didn't file a police report. He said that he had been convicted of a stolen vehicle in 1961, and he wasn't supposed to have a weapon, so he did not want to file a report about the gun being stolen. They did conduct a polygraph with Glenn McCurley, and he passed it. And so he was excluded for passing the polygraph. There were a number of suspects that came and went over the next couple of years. There had been rumors of ex-boyfriends that were in conflict with Rodney. There were some drug dealers that people had accused of abducting Carla. So there were a number of rumors out there that really had to be put to bed and ruled out. And then the case really went cold after that. In 2019, you're hoping that new technology might help you solve the case. We still had Carla's clothing, and we had Rodney's clothing. So we had a number of items that were available for us to send off for testing. They were able to get a full DNA CODIS quality profile off of the bra, and that profile was uploaded into CODIS. We were hoping that after all this time, this person that did this to Carla would have committed other acts and his DNA would have been in the system. And unfortunately, we didn't get any hits. It wasn't usable unless we had a specific DNA individual to match it up to. We learned about a lab in Houston and told them what we had, and they said, if it's good quality DNA, it's not degraded, we believe that we can work with that. But if they consume that DNA, that means it is used up and there is no more remaining to be able to be used. That was the last amount of DNA that we had. And so if this is consumed, we're back to square one.
In 1974, I was blessed. I had a good family. Not a perfect family, but a good family. Always knew my dad was my protector and provider, and I know in his heart he felt like he let his beautiful daughter down by not getting justice for her. He referred to Carla as his flower. And he used to tell Rodney, take care of my flower. By the time Mom died in 2015, I think she also too died of a broken heart. It was a very dark time. My mama died, my marriage was on the rocks, my dad had died, had a sister that could never get off my mind. It's easy to give up hope, but then you just realize that you can't give up hope. That's all you got is hope. And, every day's a new day.
My automatic reaction was, there's no way. Just total disbelief. Couldn't believe that that would even be possible. Growing up, we lived just a couple of miles from the Walkers, but didn't know anything of their family. And the love my father had for me was incredibly supportive, no matter what I did, and mistakes and all. He was always there. He had a funny side, had a magnetism about him that people loved to be around. Yeah, people loved him. Everyone did. But he felt closed off. Seems like there was always something that he was incredibly troubled about. Just didn't know what it was, though. but now it seems so clear to me. Didn't want to accept it. I think that we all still had some hope that somebody's made a mistake. This can't be true because of who we knew of him.
Glenn McCurley was hiding in plain sight for so many years. He had been married for 50 plus years. He had had 2 children. He never really did anything that brought attention to himself or his family. He really just laid very low the entire time. This was the answer that detectives had been looking for the last 46 years. I knew who did this to Carla. And, so anyway.
We're re-interviewing everybody that was in the case, and we had seen at one point they talked to Mr. McCurley.
And I told him about the same story I told you.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, you sure got the wrong fella, because I ain't never killed nobody.
He was tapping his fingers on the armrest of the chair and clenching his fists, and he was trying to figure out what did we have on him. Towards the end of it, when we did ask him again about getting a swab from him, he kind of felt obligated at that point to give it to us and not deny it. When we left his residence, I knew we would be making an arrest soon.
I've never seen her before. I don't know who she is. When was I supposed to have done this? I've never seen her, never met her, never talked to her. I wouldn't know her if she was standing beside of me.
Your DNA was on her body, which means you had to be there and you had to participate in this. There's no question about that. It is evidence that does not lie. What we're saying, Mr. McCurley, is that your DNA was found by Carla Walker. Okay? So there's no question about it.
I did do it, I guess.
Can you tell us what happened?
How did you kill her?
I just choked her.
You've been holding on to that for a long time. It's about time you let that loose.
What a huge weight.
I'd been out drinking quite a bit, and then I turned bad. It's just, I didn't mean to. I choked her to death, I guess.
So you choked her in the car, and is that where you raped her as well, in the car? And then you dropped her off at the other place?
No, I can't remember all that.
He admits to choking her and killing her, but he has a really hard time admitting to raping Carla. The one thing that he also continued to deny during the entire interview was the fact that he had this gun. And basically at the 11th hour of this interview, I just confronted him about the gun and said, "Do you still have it?"
And we're not asking you something we don't already know. We wouldn't come to you with it if we didn't already know.
You still have it?
Where do you have it in your house?
Up in Susan.
And so we immediately drafted a search warrant, took our crime scene unit out to the house and recovered the gun from exactly where he told us it would be. I mean, it's like that final piece of the puzzle that it all comes together, and he tells us the whole story.
Glenn McCurley, the gentleman who kidnapped, raped, and murdered my sister, since 1974 has lived less than a mile from the house that we live in. He drove right by the house where Carla lived, taking sons to school, picking them up. He knew where we lived, I have no doubt. That really made me angry. But I know this might be hard to believe, but it's true. I feel compassion and forgiveness. I do. And by me having compassion and forgiveness in my heart, evil has no control over my spirit or my day-to-day thoughts in life. I hope that Carla was happy. And she knew we didn't give up.
It was a very strange, sick feeling. That it was someone that lived so close that made it, I'm sorry, even worse. That he was still here in this area. And my body, just the goosebumps, just came all over my body. And tears. That's when I realized, well, he's been caught. There was a peace that I haven't had since it's happened. There was a time period that I had dreams about Carla. I had dreamed when we graduated. She was there, but I never saw her face. I just saw her long blonde hair. I dreamed that when we went to college, she was there. Any major step in life, I dreamed about her. I felt like she was living with us, but I never saw her face. And the last dream I have of her that I can vividly remember, she was on a train and she turned to look at me and I saw her face, which none of my dreams had ever had her face before. And we blew each other a kiss and she waved goodbye. And I waved goodbye to her, and I've never dreamed about her since. I feel like she's that happy wherever she is, she's that happy. And she's okay.
At one point during the interview, I asked McCurley, why did you select the spot you did to place Carla's body? And he said, well, go down this road and then there's this building and there's these bushes next to the building and I put it right there. And I said, no, Mr. McCurley, that's not where Carla was placed. Are you sure you're not getting this confused with somebody else you've done this to? And he pauses and he says, I don't think so. That's a bone-chilling moment. I don't believe that Carla was his first victim because that's not somebody's first offense. You don't start out, you escalate to this type of offense. So we're very confident that he's done this before. After looking at other cases that we have, unsolved homicides, I feel really confident that there's 3 or 4 cases that I believe Glenn McCurley could be responsible for. And I'm hoping one day we'll be able to resolve those cases. What I want the world to know about this case is that more and more cold cases are going to get solved. And if you've committed a murder and you haven't been caught, I would be worried if I was you.
It was a shock. Yeah, to say that it took the wind out of my sails is an understatement. Yeah. It crushed me. Yeah, it was tough. I love him. I love him. If there were other crimes, I wanted him to give those families some peace and confess to those things. I want him to give those families some closure. I thought if there was anybody that could open his eyes and soften his heart, it would be me, because I know he loves me. When I looked into my dad's eyes, I saw nothing. That was hard. It's hard to see that from someone who I love so much. Didn't get to talk to him about anything because he shut down. He was completely closed off. I felt deflated when I left. It's the most empty I've ever felt in my entire life. It would have been easier if he had died of something than to lose him in this way. Can't stop loving somebody. And just, it haunts me, the thought that my father, which I love so much, could spend an eternity in hell. But if he loves me at all, he has any love for me at all, he would take that overwhelming weight off of me. That's what I want. I want that peace.
His world had been completely devastated. And I said, "Righty," I said, I'm Jim Walker, how are you? And he just couldn't even talk. I said, "Can I give you a hug, buddy?" And we hugged. Yeah. I said, "Hey, you're not responsible for the sins of your father. You do not own this. This is not your responsibility."
Yeah, meeting Jim was a pretty special moment in my life. He was comforting me. And I think that surprised me, when he could have done the exact opposite. But here he is, someone that was victimized by my father. He was comforting me.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the blessing of our friendship. I realized Roddy was a victim. He was a victim as well. His dad had victimized his whole family. In your son's name we pray, amen.
Amen.
I have been blessed to become a friend of Roddy McCurley, and we've formed a good friendship.
He saw someone in a dark, desperate place and said, I'm going to give that person love. I don't know what I would do without the relationship that I have with Jim. You never know why God puts people in each other's paths. I wish it was for another reason, but I'm happy that we did.
Great visiting with you again, okay?
Love you, brother.
Love you too, man.
My whole world just fell apart at that moment. I just dropped to the ground.
I didn't know the worst of it for a long time. What kind of heart does somebody like that have? A very evil one.
To me, it looks like the House of Horrors. Had he not moved here, he would still be alive.
After seeing Kaylee in there like that, that will absolutely destroy your life.
Not only did they kill her, but the torture they put her through before. How do you let evil take over like that?
There are things about this case I don't feel comfortable saying on camera. I'm afraid for my life.
The rain came down hard enough to erase footprints. Chicago, February 17th, 2001. West Side, near midnight. Streetlights trembling in pools of dirty water. Wind tearing through alleys lined with rusted dumpsters and broken bottles. Somewhere in the distance, a train screamed across frozen tracks while televisions flickered behind apartment windows like silent witnesses refusing to speak. At 11:43 p.m., a security camera outside a laundromat captured a woman in a red coat crossing Pulaski Road alone. Head down, one hand shielding a cigarette from the wind. The footage lasted 4 seconds. For 23 years, those 4 seconds haunted Chicago. Her name was Angela Mercer, 26 years old, nursing student, waitress on the late shift at a diner off Cicero Avenue. Blonde hair, sharp tongue, smoked too much, slept too little. The kind of woman who laughed loudly enough to turn heads when she entered a room. Friends said she could handle drunk customers better than most cops handled suspects. She wanted out of the city, out of the cold, out of the endless sirens and cracked sidewalks and apartment walls thin enough to hear strangers fighting at 3 in the morning. She never got the chance. The diner closed late that night because of the storm. Angela wiped down counters while snow mixed with rain against the windows outside. A cook named Hector later told detectives she seemed distracted. Kept checking the parking lot through the glass. Twice, maybe 3 times. When he asked if something was wrong, she shrugged. Just tired, she said. But another waitress remembered something different. A man, thin, glasses, sitting alone in a dark sedan across the street for nearly an hour. Engine running, lights off, watching. Nobody called police. Nobody thought danger looked so ordinary. At 11:18 p.m., Angela clocked out. She pulled on the red coat, grabbed her cigarettes, said goodbye, walked into the freezing rain. That was the last confirmed sighting. At 12:16 a.m., her younger sister Dana left a voicemail asking if they were still meeting for breakfast Sunday morning. No response. By noon the next day, Angela's mother started calling hospitals. By evening, panic spread through the Mercer family like smoke. Angela never ignored calls, never disappeared, never vanished without warning. On Monday morning, officers forced open the door to her apartment above a boarded-up pawn shop. The television was still on, ashtray overflowing beside the couch. A half-eaten sandwich sat hardened on the kitchen counter. One lamp burned near the hallway. The place smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and cheap coffee. Nothing looked disturbed. No broken locks. No signs of struggle. But detectives immediately noticed 2 things. Her purse was gone, and so were her keys. At first, police considered voluntary disappearance. Maybe she left with someone she knew. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she'd run into trouble somewhere else. Then sanitation workers found her car, 3 blocks away, parked crooked behind an abandoned textile warehouse near Roosevelt Road. Driver's side door slightly open, engine cold, rainwater dripping from the mirrors. Inside the vehicle, Angela's purse had been dumped upside down across the passenger seat. Wallet still there. Credit cards untouched. Cash untouched. Cigarettes soaked from rain blowing through the cracked door. One high heel rested in a puddle beside the curb. The second shoe was never found. Crime scene technicians swept flashlights across the interior while reporters gathered behind police tape. Detectives opened the trunk, expecting the worst. It was empty, but not clean. There were scratches along the inside metal near the latch. Deep scratches. Violent scratches. As if someone trapped inside had clawed desperately trying to escape. The atmosphere changed instantly. This was no missing person case anymore. This was an abduction. And somewhere in Chicago, Angela Mercer might still be alive. The newspapers exploded the next morning. Chicago woman vanishes after late shift. Red coat mystery shocks West Side. Police fear abduction. Volunteers flooded the streets carrying flashlights and photocopied flyers. Churches organized search groups. Detectives searched abandoned homes, freight tunnels, drainage canals, empty warehouses. Bloodhounds tracked Angela's scent through several icy alleyways before stopping near an intersection crowded with traffic. Then the rumors started. Some believed a trafficking ring had taken her. Others whispered about a serial predator operating near Cicero Avenue. One anonymous caller claimed Angela had been targeted for weeks. Another insisted she staged the disappearance herself. Every tip dragged detectives deeper into chaos. Then came Raymond Voss, 38 years old, mechanic, prior assault charges. Witnesses claimed he harassed Angela at a gas station 2 weeks before she vanished. One cashier remembered hearing Angela threaten to call police after Voss followed her to her car. Detectives brought him in immediately. Interrogation lasted 14 hours. Voss denied everything. Police searched his apartment, dug through garbage, tore apart floorboards. Nothing. No fibers. No blood. No DNA. His alibi checked out. But by then his face had already hit local news broadcasts. Neighbors stopped talking to him. Strangers shouted killer from passing cars. And still Angela Mercer remained missing. Days dragged on. Snow turned gray along the sidewalks. Reporters camped outside police headquarters waiting for updates that never came. Angela's mother stopped sleeping. Dana carried stacks of missing posters in the trunk of her car and taped them across the city until her fingers bled from cold. Then, 13 days after Angela disappeared, Chicago received the phone call that changed everything. A group of teenage graffiti artists entered an abandoned church near South Lawndale looking for a place to spray paint. Instead, they found a body beneath a collapsed staircase wrapped in torn plastic sheeting. One of the boys vomited instantly. Another ran into the street screaming. By the time police arrived, flashing lights illuminated shattered stained glass windows while snow drifted silently through holes in the roof. Crime scene tape snapped violently in the wind. Detectives moved carefully through piles of debris toward the staircase. Angela Mercer lay partially concealed beneath broken wood and mold-covered insulation. The medical examiner would later confirm she suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head, bruising around the wrists, ligature marks on the neck, evidence of prolonged captivity. She had been alive for at least 48 hours after the abduction. That detail shattered the city. While volunteers searched frozen parks holding flyers with Angela's smiling face, she had still been breathing somewhere nearby, held prisoner, hidden behind walls, listening, waiting. The church became the center of a media storm overnight. Helicopters circled overhead. Reporters broadcast live from the crime scene. Candlelight vigils stretched along sidewalks while strangers cried openly beside Angela's photograph. And then the investigation spiraled into darkness. Detectives discovered fibers on Angela's clothing that matched industrial carpeting commonly used in warehouses and repair garages throughout the city. That clue generated hundreds of potential locations. Search warrants piled up. Tips flooded in faster than officers could process them. Every lead collapsed. Every suspect slipped away. Then came Martin Hale. Truck driver. Domestic violence history. Owned a dark blue sedan similar to witness descriptions near the diner. Lived less than 2 miles from where Angela's car was discovered. Detectives searched his home and found scratches along his forearms. Fresh scratches. Suddenly, investigators believed they finally had their man. Pressure mounted. News stations ran nonstop coverage. Angela's family prepared for arrest announcements. But forensic testing crushed everything. The scratches came from construction work. No DNA connected Hale to the crime. No fibers. No fingerprints. Nothing. Another dead end. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. The Angela Mercer murder slowly descended into the graveyard of unsolved Chicago cases. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away. Evidence boxes disappeared into storage rooms beneath police headquarters where fluorescent lights hummed endlessly over shelves packed with forgotten horrors. But one detail refused to die. Inside Angela's trunk, investigators recovered a partial fingerprint. Smudged. Incomplete. Not enough for identification. Still, detectives revisited it constantly. In 2008, improved software reanalyzed the print. No match. In 2013, forensic databases expanded nationwide. Still nothing. In 2017, another attempt failed. The fingerprint belonged to a ghost. Someone never arrested. Someone invisible. Then, in 2024, 23 years after Angela Mercer vanished into the storm, a woman in another state uploaded her ancestry DNA profile to a genealogy website searching for distant relatives. Her name was Emily Draper. She had no idea she was about to reopen one of Chicago's most infamous cold cases. The genealogy database detected a partial familial connection to unidentified forensic DNA linked to Angela's murder. Investigators partnered with forensic genealogists who began constructing family trees from public records, marriage licenses, obituaries, birth certificates. Slowly, one branch narrowed toward a single name. Daniel Hargrove, 54 years old, maintenance worker, divorced, no major criminal record, no history of violence, lived quietly outside Joliet in a modest ranch home with peeling paint and overgrown grass. On paper, he looked harmless, forgettable, exactly the kind of man nobody notices standing beside them in line at a grocery store. But investigators uncovered something chilling buried in old employment records. On the night Angela disappeared, Hargrove clocked out from work less than 20 minutes before she left the diner. His route home passed directly along Pulaski Road. Then detectives found an archived witness statement from 2001 buried deep in old files. A waitress remembered seeing a thin man with glasses, watching Angela through the diner window multiple nights that winter. Nobody followed up. Nobody connected it. Until now. Police launched surveillance almost immediately. For weeks, investigators watched Hargrove's every movement. He drank coffee alone at the same convenience store every morning, visited flea markets on Sundays, paid in cash, spoke little. Normal. Terrifyingly normal. Then detectives collected a discarded coffee cup after he threw it into a trash can outside a gas station. The DNA came back 3 days later. Match. Definitive. The skin cells beneath Angela Mercer's fingernails belonged to Daniel Hargrove. After 23 years, the ghost finally had a face. But what investigators discovered next turned the reopened cold case into a nightmare far worse than anyone imagined. Police executed a search warrant at Hargrove's property just before dawn. They expected old photographs, maybe newspaper clippings, trophies hidden in boxes. Instead, officers discovered a locked crawlspace beneath the garage floor. Inside sat dozens of cassette tapes carefully labeled by year. Some dated back to 1998, others to 2005. Detectives carried the tapes into evidence while reporters gathered outside the property under flashing lights. Hours later, investigators played the first recording. The room reportedly fell silent. A woman crying, chains rattling faintly in the background. Then a calm male voice. Flat, controlled, asking softly if she wanted to go home. And when the woman answered, several detectives froze. Because the voice sounded exactly like Angela Mercer. Nobody in the room spoke after the tape stopped. The recorder clicked once. Silence. Then another click as the cassette spun uselessly against empty reels. Detectives stared through the observation room glass while the audio technician slowly removed his headphones, his face drained white beneath fluorescent lights. One investigator later described the atmosphere as a funeral mixed with a bomb threat. People had spent 23 years believing Angela Mercer died in an abandoned church after a random act of violence. But the tape suggested something far worse. Captivity. Planning. Control. The voice on the recording sounded weak, exhausted, terrified. Every sentence trembled as if spoken through pain and dehydration. But there was something even more disturbing hidden beneath the fear. Angela sounded familiar with the man speaking to her. Not comfortable, not calm, but familiar. As if by the time that tape was recorded, she already understood exactly what he was capable of. Investigators immediately sent the audio for enhancement. Background noises were isolated, static removed, frequencies cleaned. Every second became evidence. Analysts identified the hum of an industrial ventilation system somewhere behind the voices. At one point, a metallic banging echoed faintly in the distance. Another sound resembled passing freight trains. That detail hit detectives hard. Daniel Hargrove had worked maintenance near multiple rail depots in 2001. Suddenly, the entire city map changed. Search teams reopened abandoned industrial properties connected to Hargrove's employment history. Warehouses, garages, storage facilities, empty repair buildings demolished years earlier. Detectives dug through ancient records searching for locations with basement access or soundproof utility rooms. Meanwhile, national media exploded. Chicago cold case reopened after DNA breakthrough. Secret tapes discovered in Mercer murder investigation. Police fear additional victims. Cable news anchors called it one of the most disturbing forensic genealogy breakthroughs in modern criminal history. Former detectives came out of retirement for interviews. Reporters flooded the neighborhood outside Hargrove's home. Helicopters circled overhead day and night, while strangers left flowers beneath Angela Mercer's old missing person posters, now reposted online by thousands. And still, Daniel Hargrove refused to speak. During interrogation, he barely moved. Sat perfectly still. Hands folded. Eyes fixed on the table. Detectives confronted him with the DNA evidence first. No reaction. Then the tapes. Nothing. Finally, investigators played Angela's voice aloud inside the interrogation room. For the first time, Hargrove blinked. One detective leaned forward. "Did you keep her alive?" Silence. "Daniel, how many others were there?" Nothing. Another detective slammed photographs across the table. Crime scene images. Angela's recovered belongings. Pictures from the abandoned church. Still no response. Then came the sentence that changed the room. "You buried her alive emotionally long before she died." Hargrove slowly lifted his eyes and smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to freeze everyone watching behind the glass. Interrogators pushed harder. They demanded locations, names, timelines. But Hargrove spoke only 6 words during the first 12-hour interview. She wasn't the first one. That statement detonated through Chicago like a grenade. Suddenly, investigators weren't reopening one cold case anymore. They were hunting for ghosts. Within days, detectives reopened missing person files spanning nearly 15 years. Women vanished near freight routes. Unsolved murders involving abandoned properties. Cases dismissed decades earlier because forensic evidence had been too weak to prosecute. Analysts pinned photographs across entire conference room walls, while retired investigators returned carrying dusty boxes of forgotten reports. Patterns emerged quickly. Young women, late-night shifts, industrial neighborhoods, disappearances during heavy rain or snowstorms, victims who vanished within walking distance of transit corridors linked to Hargrove's old maintenance routes. The city panicked all over again. People who remembered Angela Mercer suddenly remembered other names too. Rachel Dunn, missing in 1998 after leaving a movie theater. Tanya Velasquez, disappeared in 2003 walking home from a bus stop. Melissa Crane, found murdered near an abandoned switching yard in 2005. Back then, detectives never connected the crimes. Now they looked horrifyingly similar. At Hargrove's house, forensic teams tore apart walls, flooring, crawl spaces, plumbing pipes. Cadaver dogs searched every inch of the property. Neighbors watched from behind curtains while investigators carried out box after box of evidence. Then officers uncovered a hidden compartment beneath a basement workbench. Inside sat dozens of identification cards, women's jewelry, photographs, and a stack of newspaper clippings covering unsolved disappearances dating back to the late 90s. Some articles had circles drawn around victims' faces in red marker. One clipping featured Angela Mercer's obituary. Across the top, someone had written a single sentence. She fought harder than the others. The discovery turned public fear into outrage. People demanded answers immediately. How had this man stayed invisible for so long? How many opportunities had investigators missed? Why had nobody connected the disappearances earlier? Former detectives defended themselves publicly. Chicago in the early 2000s was drowning in violent crime. Hundreds of homicide cases, limited forensic technology, fragmented databases, different precincts handling different disappearances with almost no communication. But for Angela's family, those explanations meant nothing. Dana Mercer reportedly collapsed after learning investigators believed Hargrove may have targeted multiple women over decades. Angela's mother stopped giving interviews entirely. Friends described her as emotionally shattered all over again, as though the original funeral had happened yesterday. And then another tape surfaced. This one labeled simply, March 2001. Investigators played it inside a secured evidence room with homicide supervisors present. The recording began with static. Then footsteps. A metal door creaking open. Angela crying softly somewhere nearby. Hargrove's voice emerged again, calm and terrifyingly patient. You made me do this. Seconds later, another sound appeared. A second female voice. Not Angela. Different tone. Different cadence. The room froze. There had been another victim alive in that location at the same time. Analysts replayed the tape repeatedly. The unidentified woman could be heard coughing faintly before whispering something unintelligible. Audio specialists enhanced every frequency possible, eventually isolating 2 words. Please know. Detectives immediately compared the voice against archived recordings from missing women connected to reopened investigations. Families across Illinois began receiving calls from homicide units asking for old home videos, voicemail recordings, answering machine tapes. Hope and horror collided together. Some families desperately wanted answers. Others feared them. Meanwhile, investigators dug deeper into Hargrove's history and discovered details that made the case even darker. In 1996, Hargrove had volunteered briefly with a church outreach program assisting homeless shelters around Chicago rail districts. Detectives uncovered reports from several women who later remembered feeling uncomfortable around him. One described him as too quiet. Another claimed he stared at people like he already knew something bad about them. None reported actual crimes. Nothing actionable. Nothing enough to stop him. In retrospect, every memory sounded sinister. Then forensic accountants uncovered another disturbing clue. Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, Hargrove rented multiple storage units under variations of his name. Most records were long destroyed, but one facility outside Cicero still existed. Police arrived before sunrise. Television helicopters followed. The storage manager unlocked Unit 214 while armed officers surrounded the corridor. Inside sat rusted tools, old tires, broken furniture. At first glance, nothing unusual. Then investigators noticed fresh concrete covering part of the floor near the rear wall. Workers brought in excavation equipment immediately. Reporters gathered outside the gate as rumors spread online in real time. Social media erupted with speculation about bodies hidden beneath the unit. Hours later, forensic teams uncovered human remains. Female. Partial skeletal recovery. Bound with electrical wire. The entire investigation transformed overnight from a reopened cold case into a suspected serial homicide operation spanning years. And still Daniel Hargrove refused to explain anything. During subsequent interrogations, he maintained the same eerie composure. Detectives described him as emotionally hollow. No anger, no panique, no remorse, only control. At one point, investigators asked why he kept the tapes. Hargrove answered quietly, so they wouldn't disappear. The sentence disturbed even veteran homicide detectives, because buried underneath the horror was something deeply warped. He wanted the victims remembered, preserved, not as people, as possessions. Psychological profilers entered the investigation soon after. They believed Hargrove viewed himself less as a killer and more as a collector of moments. The recordings suggested emotional manipulation, prolonged captivity, and obsessive documentation. Experts warned investigators there could be far more victims than evidence currently showed. Then another discovery changed everything again. Forensic analysts enhanced reflections visible inside one cassette tape photograph recovered from the basement compartment. In the corner of the image, partially obscured behind Angela, appeared a calendar hanging on a wall. The visible date read, March 9, 2001. Detectives immediately recognized the significance. Angela Mercer's body had officially been discovered March 2nd. That meant one impossible possibility now loomed over the investigation. The body found inside the abandoned church may not have been placed there immediately after death. Someone could have returned later, moved her, staged the scene. The timeline exploded into chaos. Medical examiners reopened autopsy records. Original crime scene photographs were rescanned using modern technology. Investigators revisited witness sightings near the church during the first week of March 2001. Then an elderly witness came forward after seeing news coverage. A retired bus driver named Leonard Pike. He claimed that during the early morning hours of March 8, 2001, he saw a man unloading large plastic sheets near the abandoned church during heavy snowfall. At the time, Pike assumed someone was dumping construction debris illegally. When shown an aged photograph lineup, Pike pointed directly at Daniel Hargrove. Detectives now believed Angela may have been held captive for nearly 3 weeks before her body was discovered. 3 weeks. Alive while the city searched. Alive while her family begged for help on television. Alive while volunteers taped missing posters across freezing streets. The realization devastated investigators. Some reportedly left the briefing room unable to speak. And the deeper detectives dug into Hargrove's life, the more disturbing the picture became. Neighbors remembered hearing strange metallic noises from his garage late at night for years. One former girlfriend described locked rooms she was never allowed to enter. Another recalled finding women's jewelry in a kitchen drawer before Hargrove became enraged and threw her out of the house. Nobody reported him. Nobody imagined the truth. Then investigators searched digital archives connected to Hargrove's old computers. What they uncovered sent another shockwave through the case. Hundreds of internet forum posts discussing missing persons investigations across the Midwest. Anonymous comments criticizing police mistakes. Detailed discussions about forensic limitations. Even posts reacting emotionally to Angela Mercer's disappearance in real time back in 2001. Detectives believed Hargrove had been following media coverage of his own crimes for years, possibly even communicating with online communities discussing the cold cases. One post dated April 2001 read, "They're searching in the wrong places. She was closer than anyone realized." The username traced back to an email account connected to Hargrove. By now, fear spread far beyond Chicago. True crime communities online dissected every detail obsessively. Amateur investigators flooded police tip lines. Families of missing women nationwide began contacting Cook County detectives, asking whether their loved ones might somehow connect to Hargrove. Then came the discovery investigators would later describe as the most horrifying moment of the entire case. Inside the final unopened cassette case recovered from the crawlspace sat a tape labeled only with one word written in black marker. Basement. When technicians inserted the cassette into evidence playback equipment, the recording began with breathing. Heavy breathing. Then footsteps descending wooden stairs. A door opening. And multiple female voices crying somewhere in darkness. The moment the word basement echoed through the speakers, the entire evidence room shifted. No one moved at first. Even the recording technician kept his hand hovering above the pause button like touching it might break something irreversible. Then the tape continued. Breathing. Close. Vet. Uneven. As if the microphone had been carried down narrow stairs pressed against a body. The sound of wood creaking followed, slow and deliberate. Each step measured like someone descending into a place they knew too well. A door opened. Metal scraping against concrete. Then silence so complete it felt engineered. And beneath it, faint at first, came voices. Not one. Several. Crying layered over crying. A whisper that might have been a name, swallowed by static before it could be understood. One detective stepped backward without realizing it, bumping into a filing cabinet hard enough to rattle drawers. Nobody reacted. Everyone was listening to something that didn't belong in a police station. Something that should have never been preserved on magnetic tape for 23 years. Then Daniel Hargrove's voice entered again. Calm. Measured. Almost conversational. Stay still. It's colder when you move. The words hit the room like a physical impact. Cold. Not metaphorical. Not poetic. Literal. Describing a condition. A place. A system of control that extended beyond fear into environment, into sensation, into time itself. Angela Mercer's voice followed seconds later, weaker than before, fractured at the edges as if the recording itself struggled to hold her together. Please, I can't. A pause. Then another female voice. Not Angela. Different pitch. Different exhaustion. Different terror. You told me the same thing. The room froze. Detectives looked at each other in silence that carried more weight than shouting ever could. The implication landed slowly, like something falling through deep water. Angela was not alone on that tape. She was not the only one recorded. Not the only one speaking from wherever this basement existed. Someone else had been there. Alive. Suffering. Remembering. The tape abruptly shifted tone, as if the recorder had been moved or set down on a surface. A metallic clang echoed, followed by what sounded like a bucket being dragged across concrete. Then footsteps again, circling unhurried. Hargrove spoke softly. You learn faster than she did. A sharp inhale from one of the women. Asuppresed sobi. Then silence broken only by distant mechanical humming, steady and industrial, like ventilation systems designed to erase sound from the world above. Detectives later confirmed that specific frequency matched older freight maintenance facilities along Chicago rail corridors. Buildings half demolished. Some repurposed. Some abandoned so long they no longer appeared in city maps. Suddenly, the case stopped being about one location. It became about every place Hargrove had ever had access to. Every shift. Every job site. Every forgotten structure with a locked door and no surveillance. Outside the interrogation building, dawn broke over Chicago in pale gray streaks. Reporters had not left. Cameras were already rolling. The phrase basement tape began circulating within minutes of the first leaked detail, though officials refused to confirm its contents. Inside, investigators regrouped. The initial theory of a single murder case collapsed completely. What replaced it was heavier, harder to define. A pattern not limited by time, but reinforced by repetition. A structure of behavior spanning years, possibly decades. A forensic analyst pinned new maps across the wall, red strings connecting freight depots, maintenance yards, abandoned churches, storage facilities, rental properties. Each location tied to Hargrove's employment history. Each point a potential echo of the same hidden architecture. One investigator muttered under his breath that it looked less like a case file and more like a blueprint. Meanwhile, Daniel Hargrove remained in the interview room. Still, unmoved. When detectives entered with updated evidence logs, he didn't look up. The lead investigator placed the tape transcript in front of him. You knew we'd find this. No answer. We've got multiple voices now. That means multiple victims. That means this wasn't just Angela Mercer. Still nothing. Then the investigator slid photographs across the table. Enhanced stills from the basement tape. Blurry silhouettes. A corner of a room. Chains partially visible. A calendar pinned to a wall. And then something unexpected happened. Hargrove leaned forward slightly. Not toward the photographs. Toward the soundproof glass behind the detectives. As if listening to something outside the room that no one else could hear. One of the detectives noticed and followed his gaze instinctively. Nothing was there. Just corridor lights and distant movement. But Hargrove smiled again. The same small, controlled expression from the previous interrogation. Then he spoke, barely audible. You're late. The sentence didn't make sense in isolation. But in the context of everything already uncovered, it created a new kind of fear. Not fear of what had happened. Fear of what might still be happening. Fear that the case, even now, was not fully in the past. The interrogation escalated immediately. What does that mean? Late for what? Who else is there? But Hargrove returned to silence. Hours passed like that. Pressure building without release. Detectives cycling through evidence, trying different angles, different emotional triggers. Nothing broke him. Until a new name appeared. Not spoken by police. Not introduced deliberately. but brought in accidentally during a procedural review of old case files projected onto a screen in the adjacent room. A missing woman from 1999. Elena Park. When her photo appeared briefly on the monitor, something subtle changed in Hargrove's posture. Barely noticeable, but enough. His fingers tightened once against each other, then relaxed. That single movement triggered immediate reaction behind the glass. Investigators paused everything, zoomed the image, checked old missing person logs. Elena Park had vanished near a rail station maintenance corridor 2 years before Angela Mercer disappeared. Case originally classified as runaway. No evidence. No witnesses. No recovery. Reopened files now showed inconsistencies that had been ignored at the time. A security guard report mentioning a man loitering near service tunnels. A partial description matching Hargrove's build. An unverified sighting of a woman matching Elena's description entering a restricted freight access door. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it meant everything. The investigation expanded again overnight. What had been a single cold case evolved into a multi-year pattern spanning at least the late 1990s through early 2000s, possibly longer. Analysts worked without sleep. Coffee cups stacked on desks. Phones rang constantly as new potential links surfaced from archived databases. Families of missing women were contacted again. Some had waited decades for answers. Some had stopped waiting years ago. And then the second tape analysis arrived. The forensic audio team had finished isolating background frequencies from the basement recording. Among the noise, they identified something that had not been obvious during initial playback. A distinct third voice. Male. Different from Hargrove. Not recorded clearly enough for identification, but present within the same space. That detail changed everything again. If accurate, it meant access. It meant another person inside the environment. Another participant. Or another victim forced to speak under duress. Detectives began re-examining everyone connected to Hargrove's employment history during the relevant years. Co-workers, supervisors, contractors, security personnel, anyone with overlapping access to industrial sites. The scope widened uncontrollably. Meanwhile, outside the station, the city was already reacting. Old missing person posters resurfaced online. Community forums lit up with renewed speculation. News channels ran continuous coverage with graphics mapping suspected locations across Illinois. The phrase Chicago basement case trended nationally within hours. But inside the interrogation room, time felt detached from everything outside. Hargrove had not spoken for over 6 hours. Then, without warning, he finally did. Not to answer a question. Not to respond to pressure. But to correct something. She wasn't in the church first, he said quietly. The room went still. Angela wasn't the first one you found. He lifted his eyes slowly. Just the first one you recognized. And in that distinction, investigators realized the full scale of what they were dealing with was still far from complete. Not a single crime. Not even a series of crimes neatly contained. But something layered. Something hidden in repetition. Something that had survived for decades by never appearing the same way twice. And somewhere beneath Chicago's streets, beneath abandoned buildings and forgotten corridors, the silence after Hargrove's last sentence didn't end. It just changed shape. Inside the interrogation room, even the air felt heavier, as if the building itself had absorbed what was said and refused to release it back into circulation. Just the first one you recognized. That line repeated through every headset, every recording device, every observer's memory, looping without permission. Outside the glass, detectives no longer looked at each other directly. They looked at files, screens, anything that didn't look back. Because the implication had shifted the entire case. Recognition meant oversight. Recognition meant blindness had been selective. And if Angela Mercer was only the first victim they could identify, then everything built so far was not the beginning of the story. It was the middle. The forensic team pulled every archived file tied to Hargrove's known employment routes again, this time stripping away assumptions that had guided earlier searches. No longer focused on confirmed locations, they expanded into proximity patterns, timing overlaps, and logistical blind spots, places where industrial access overlapped with commuter routes, where late-night shifts created windows of invisibility measured in minutes rather than hours. The map grew denser. Not with certainty. With possibility. Red pins multiplied across Chicago's west side, stretching outward into suburbs, rail yards, and storage districts that once operated under different ownerships, different security systems, different eras of record-keeping. The more they added, the less it looked like a linear path. It looked like coverage, like saturation, like someone had learned where the world stopped watching and made use of every inch of it. Meanwhile, the cassette-labeled basement was replayed again and again under controlled conditions, each iteration revealing something new in the background noise. Not just voices, not just movement, but structure. The sound of water dripping at irregular intervals suggested uneven ceilings or exposed piping. A low mechanical pulse hinted at aging compressors or industrial refrigeration units cycling off-grid. At one point, a distant metallic resonance echoed with a rhythm that analysts later compared to freight loading schedules. The conclusion was tentative but chilling. This wasn't a single room. It was part of a system, and systems meant repetition. Inside the interrogation room, Hargrove sat unchanged. Same posture, same hands folded neatly on the table, same expression that refused to commit to emotion in any direction that could be used against him. Detectives tried a different approach. They brought in timelines. Not accusations. Not questions. Just sequences. They laid out Angela Mercer's disappearance hour by hour, cross-referenced with his known movements from employment records. Then they added Elena Park. Then Rachel Dunn. Then Tanya Velasquez. Each name placed carefully on a wall chart like points in a constellation that only made sense when seen from far enough away. Still, Hargrove said nothing, until the investigator pointed at a gap. A 6-hour window in late February 2001, just days before Angela vanished, where Hargrove's whereabouts were unverified. No clock-in, no witness, no record, just absence. That's where she started disappearing, the detective said. For the first time, Hargrove's gaze shifted downward. Not at the chart, at the floor. Then, softly, almost absent-mindedly, he responded. She didn't start there. The investigator leaned forward. Then where did she start? A pause, long enough that it felt deliberate. Then, she started noticing. The sentence landed differently than anything before it. Not a confession, not a denial, something else entirely. A reframing, a reversal of perspective that placed the origin of everything not in action, but in awareness. Behind the glass, one analyst quietly wrote a single word in his notebook: escalation. Because now the pattern wasn't just about abduction or containment. It was about selection, about attention, about being seen. The forensic psychologist assigned to the case requested immediate access to all surviving audio materials, including raw, unenhanced versions of every cassette recovered from the crawlspace. Within hours, she identified something overlooked in earlier reviews. Not in what was said, but in what wasn't. Across multiple recordings, there were consistent pauses before Hargrove spoke. Not random silence. Structured silence. Intervals that matched response timing patterns rather than spontaneous conversation. It suggested rehearsal, or control of pacing, or something even more unsettling, that the conversations were never meant to be conversations at all. They were performances designed for a listener who might not have been present at every moment. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, media pressure intensified. New footage from the search of Hargrove's property leaked to public channels despite official restrictions. Grainy images of the crawlspace, the cassette labels, the basement transcript fragments. Social media amplified every detail, reconstructing theories in real time, often incorrectly, but always with increasing intensity. The phrase viral genealogy breakthrough was now attached to every headline, as if DNA had not just solved a case, but unlocked a door that had been sealed for decades. And then, at 3:17 a.m., a new discovery changed the direction of the investigation again. A maintenance log. Recovered from a defunct freight contractor database, it contained entries from a subcontracted cleaning crew assigned briefly to industrial facilities near Cicero Avenue in 2000 and 2001. Most entries were routine, but one line stood out. Unauthorized basement access reported. Door re-secured. No follow-up requested. No address listed. Just coordinates. When cross-referenced with Hargrove's employment route during that period, it overlapped with a facility previously dismissed as irrelevant due to demolition records. A building that no longer existed. Only its footprint remained. Detectives arrived at the site before sunrise. It was a fenced-off construction zone now, gravel and steel beams replacing what had once been a warehouse complex. Floodlights cast long shadows across unfinished foundations. The ground had already been partially excavated for new development. But forensic teams didn't need the surface. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed immediately. Within minutes, anomalies appeared beneath the concrete. Void spaces, irregular cavities, structures that did not match the current construction plan. Reporters gathered at the perimeter by dawn, sensing escalation even without official confirmation. Cameras captured officials refusing to answer questions, while engineers marked sections of the ground with fluorescent paint. Then excavation began. Slow, controlled, mechanical. Hours passed. And then, beneath layers of soil, concrete, and industrial debris, they found a sealed space. Not large, but deliberate. A chamber, reinforced, hidden within the structural remains of the original warehouse foundation. When the access point was finally opened, the air that escaped was stale enough to make several officers step back instinctively. Inside, there were markings on the walls. Dates, names, not complete lists. Fragments, as if someone had been documenting without intention of finishing. And on the far wall, beneath layers of faded paint and moisture damage, investigators discovered something that stopped the entire excavation crew. A sequence of tally marks, grouped in uneven clusters. Each cluster separated by gaps of time that matched years, not days. Above them, written in faded ink that had survived despite everything. Do not count them wrong. No one spoke for several minutes. Because suddenly, the question was no longer how many victims there were. It was whether anyone had ever been counted correctly at all. Back at the station, Hargrove was informed that a subterranean chamber had been located. For the first time, something shifted. Not panic, not fear. Recognition. He looked up slowly and said only one thing. You opened it too early. And for the first time since the investigation began, detectives understood that whatever had been contained beneath Chicago was not simply a record of past crimes. It was still connected to the present. The words "you opened it too early" didn't echo in the interrogation room the way people expected them to. They settled, like something heavy being placed gently on a table, deliberately, so it wouldn't break, but also so it couldn't be ignored. For a moment, no one responded. Not because they didn't understand, but because every interpretation that came to mind was worse than the last. Behind the glass, the excavation feed from the warehouse site was still live. Grainy night vision footage showed officers moving carefully through the subterranean chamber, flashlights cutting through dust that had not been disturbed in decades. Every step raised fine particles into the air like ash from something long burned, but never extinguished. On the walls of that chamber, the markings remained unchanged. Dates, names, tally clusters, and that phrase written above them. Do not count them wrong. The forensic anthropologist on site had already stopped speaking entirely. At one point, she removed her gloves, stared at the markings, and quietly stepped out of the chamber without explanation. No one stopped her, because no one had a better reaction to suggest. Back inside the interrogation room, detectives resumed questioning, but the rhythm had changed. It was no longer pressure versus resistance. It was uncertainty against something that refused to fully define itself. Too early for what? The lead investigator asked. Hargrove didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening again to something only he could hear through layers of concrete, distance, and time. Then, softly, for them to remember correctly. The phrasing triggered immediate discussion behind the glass. Analysts circled it, underlined it, replayed it, dissected it. Correctly suggested not just memory, but version control. Competing narratives. Altered perception. The implication that what investigators believed they knew about the past might already be incomplete by design. Outside, dawn fully broke over Chicago, but the light did nothing to soften what was unfolding. News helicopters circled the excavation site. Live broadcasts showed the sealed chamber entrance, now fully exposed, while officials attempted to control access. The phrase, "do not count them wrong," was already circulating online, stripped of context, turned into speculation, myth, fear. Inside the chamber, investigators found something new. A narrow corridor leading deeper. Not part of the original warehouse foundation. Not part of any recorded architectural plan. A later addition. The walls here were different. cleaner, reinforced with newer materials than the surrounding structure. That contrast alone shifted the entire investigative theory again. The chamber had not simply been hidden, it had been modified over time. This was not a relic. It was maintained. At the far end of the corridor, they discovered a second sealed space. Smaller, more controlled, and inside it, something that forced the entire team to pause at the threshold. Rows of cassette tapes, not randomly placed, organized, chronological, each labeled in the same handwriting seen on Hargrove's crawlspace collection, but more precise here, more deliberate, as if this section represented a continuation rather than a separate archive. One technician reached for a tape, then stopped himself, waiting for authorization that took several minutes to arrive. When it finally did, the tape was removed carefully, placed into a sealed playback unit, and transmitted back to the station. In the interrogation room, Hargrove watched the monitor as if anticipating the moment. The tape began. Different this time. No immediate voices. Just silence. Extended. Measured. Then a faint sound, paper turning. And a woman speaking. Not Angela Mercer. Not any voice previously identified. Calm. Controlled. Almost clinical. He's consistent, she said. But not complete. A pause. Then another voice responded from somewhere off mic. He never is. Detectives froze. This was not victim audio. This was dialogue. Between people who understood the environment, understood the system, and were discussing it as if it had structure. The recording continued. We need to adjust the classification, the first voice said. That will complicate the count, the second replied. A faint laugh, low, tired, not amused. The count was never stable. At that point, the lead investigator stopped the playback remotely. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Voices overlapped. Analysts demanded verification. Someone insisted the tape might have been mislabeled or contaminated. Others argued it was impossible for multiple speaking roles to exist in the same recording without earlier detection. But the forensic audio specialist shook his head. No, he said quietly. This is clean. This is intentional. Back in the interrogation room, Hargrove finally leaned back in his chair for the first time since questioning began. Not relaxed. Repositioned. Like someone adjusting themselves to a familiar argument. They're still arguing, he said. The lead investigator narrowed his eyes. Who is they? Hargrove didn't answer directly. Instead, you think this started with me. Silence. You think it ends with me. Another pause. That's the mistake. Behind the glass, the excavation team reported something new from the chamber. A hidden panel had been discovered behind one of the reinforced walls. It did not match the construction style of the rest of the structure. When opened, it revealed a narrow vertical shaft descending further into darkness. Deeper than expected. Far deeper than municipal records could justify. And at the bottom, faint electrical wiring was still active. Still drawing power. The entire site went into lockdown protocol within minutes. Because now the question had shifted again. It was no longer about historical crimes. It was about current function. Something beneath Chicago was still operating. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted Hargrove with the new discovery. A powered system under the chamber, the investigator said. That wasn't in place in 2001. That wasn't you. For the first time, Hargrove didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands. Then, almost quietly, I never built it. A pause. But I learned how it worked. The words hit harder than anything before. Because they implied continuity without origin. Participation without authorship. A structure that existed before him, or beyond him, or outside the limits of what investigators had been prepared to imagine. The interrogation shifted again. Who else is involved? No answer. Daniel, listen carefully. If there are other people, if this is ongoing. Hargrove interrupted, still calm. It's always ongoing. That was when the lights in the interrogation room flickered once. Just once. Barely noticeable. But enough for every person in the room to feel it. At the same time, a technician in the monitoring station reported a sudden spike in audio interference from the excavation site feed. Static flooded the channel for exactly 7 seconds. Then cleared. And when it cleared, one thing had changed. A new sound had been captured. Not from the tape. Not from playback. From the chamber itself. A door closing. Slow. Deliberate. From somewhere deeper underground, than anyone currently standing could see. Back at the interrogation table, Hargrove finally looked directly at the lead investigator again and said, with quiet certainty, "Now you've got their attention." And for the first time in the entire investigation, it no longer felt like they were uncovering a case. It felt like something was responding to them. The moment Hargrove said, "Now you've got their attention," the room stopped feeling like a place of interrogation and started feeling like a listening post. Not for him, for something else. Something that, until that point, investigators had only treated as history buried in concrete and cassette tape. The lights overhead steadied again, but nobody trusted them anymore. Even the hum of the ventilation system sounded slightly off, as if the building had subtly retuned itself after hearing those words. Behind the glass, the excavation feed had gone unstable. Static came and went in waves, like something passing between the signal and its source. Engineers adjusted frequencies, checked hardware, swapped transmission lines, but the interference persisted with unnerving timing. Every time the underground chamber camera stabilized, it seemed to return to the same angle, focused on the vertical shaft that descended beyond the sealed structure. The active wiring below it was still drawing power. Still functioning. Still unknown. A technician whispered, almost to himself, "That shouldn't be live." No one corrected him, because everyone already knew that it shouldn't be. Inside the interrogation room, the lead investigator stepped closer to the table. "No more games," he said. "If there's someone else down there, if this is still active, you tell us exactly what we're walking into." Hargrove's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A shift, subtle and internal, like a door opening that had never fully been closed. "You already walked in," he said. Then he leaned forward slightly. "And you've been inside it longer than you think." That sentence changed the tone of everything again. Not accusation. Not threat. Reorientation. As if the investigation itself had always been part of the system it was trying to uncover. Behind the glass, one analyst quietly began reviewing timestamp logs from the initial cassette playback. Another rechecked surveillance footage from the interrogation room. A third pulled building schematics, cross-referencing structural anomalies reported during construction decades earlier. Patterns began to emerge that no one wanted to acknowledge. Certain maintenance records had gaps. Not random gaps. Consistent ones. Aligned with specific years where disappearances clustered. At the excavation site, the vertical shaft had now been fully mapped using remote imaging equipment. What they saw made the engineers go silent. The shaft did not end in a natural collapse or utility termination point. It connected to something constructed, below the warehouse foundation, below the chamber, a second layer of infrastructure, older in some sections, newer in others, a hybrid system built across time rather than in a single phase, and it extended beyond the property boundary. That discovery triggered immediate expansion of the search perimeter. Ground-penetrating radar units were deployed across adjacent lots. Within an hour, anomalies began appearing in a pattern that resembled branching corridors. Not isolated pockets. Not random voids. A network. Back in the interrogation room, the lead investigator placed new photographs on the table. Maps of underground readings. Structural overlays. Red lines spreading outward from the excavation site like veins. "We're not just talking about one location anymore," he said. "We're looking at connected structures. Multiple access points. Possibly spanning blocks." Hargrove nodded once. As it always did. The simplicity of that answer unsettled the room more than denial would have, because it implied normality. Routine. Continuity. As if what investigators were seeing now was simply the part they had finally become aware of, not something newly created. The psychologist assigned to the case leaned forward behind the glass. "He's not reacting like a suspect," she said quietly. "He's reacting like someone confirming an inventory." At that moment, another audio file arrived from the excavation site, recovered from deeper within the vertical shaft using a directional microphone lowered into the void. It was not a tape. It was live capture. Unprocessed. Raw. At first, only ambient noise came through. Low-frequency vibration. Air movement through confined space. Then something unexpected. A voice. Not Hargrove's. Not any previously recorded voice. A woman speaking, faint but steady, as if aware she was being heard. "They changed the access point again," she said. A pause. Then another voice responded, closer, sharper. Not all of them. Just the visible ones. Silence followed. Then footsteps. Measured. Descending. The audio technician instinctively pulled his headphones off. That's coming from below current excavation depth, he said. That's not surface reflection. That's direct. The implication hit immediately. Whatever was speaking was beneath the structure they had already reached. Not part of what had been uncovered. Part of what still remained hidden. Back in interrogation, the feed was relayed to Hargrove in real time. For the first time since his arrest, he closed his eyes briefly. Not in relief. Not in fear. In recognition. They're adjusting, he said softly. The lead investigator snapped immediately. Adjusting what? Hargrove opened his eyes again. The system. That word again. System. Not building. Not crime scene. System. Behind the glass, the excavation team reported a sudden change in electrical readings from the underground wiring. Voltage fluctuations spiked, then stabilized into a steady pulse pattern that resembled timing synchronization rather than random failure. A maintenance engineer stared at the graph and slowly said, "This looks like it's responding to activity." No one asked what activity, because the answer was already in the room, or in the tape, or in the conversation happening beneath their feet. Then came the moment that escalated everything again. A new signal appeared in the shaft audio feed. Stronger, clearer, closer. A voice, male this time, speaking with calm urgency. Surface breach acknowledged. Silence. Then, containment layer compromised. The control room erupted instantly. No one had used those terms in official documentation. No known engineering report referred to anything as containment layer. That language belonged to something else entirely. Something structured. Something intentional. And yet it was being spoken underground. As if describing procedure. As if responding to protocol. In the interrogation room, Hargrove didn't react outwardly to the panic erupting behind the glass. He simply watched. And then, very quietly, "They're going to close it." The lead investigator turned sharply. "Close what?" Hargrove looked at him directly. "Everything you just opened." At that exact moment, all live feeds from the excavation site cut out simultaneously. Every monitor, every channel, every backup transmission. Gone. For half a second, the entire station thought it was a technical failure. Then the emergency system activated. A single automated alert flashed across internal screens. Unauthorized system response detected. No further input required. Do not reconnect manually. And beneath it, one final line appeared. Origin confirmed active. No one in the room spoke. Because suddenly, the case was no longer about what had happened in 2001. It was about what was happening right now. And Daniel Hargrove, still seated calmly at the interrogation table, finally said the only thing that mattered in that moment. "I told you," he said. "You opened it too early." When the feeds cut out, the silence that followed wasn't normal silence. It was an absence of continuity. Like the building had been connected to something, and someone had just unplugged reality from the other side. Every monitor in the station froze on the same frame. The last image from the excavation shaft, grainy and unstable, pointing into darkness that no longer transmitted anything back. No static. No error noise. Just a hard stop, as if the signal had been politely declined. Then the emergency message vanished too. Not replaced. Removed. As though it had never been authorized to exist in the first place. Inside the interrogation room, no one moved for several seconds. Even the lead investigator, usually quick to override uncertainty with procedure, stood still with his hand hovering near his radio without pressing it. The room felt suddenly smaller. Not physically, but perceptually, as if the walls had shifted inward by a few centimeters and refused to admit it. Hargrove remained seated, watching them, not satisfied, not surprised, just aware. Behind the glass, technicians tried to restore the excavation feed. Backup systems failed instantly. Secondary channels returned identical results. Nothing. Not black screens. Not corrupted footage. Empty pipelines where data should have been flowing. One engineer finally said what no one wanted to hear. "It's not down." A pause. "It's gone." That word changed everything again. Gone implied completion. Not interruption. Not malfunction. Something had been removed from the system entirely, as if it had been extracted instead of disrupted. And somewhere beneath Chicago, beneath concrete and steel and layers of forgotten industrial history, something had just stopped responding, or had stopped being available to respond. The interrogation resumed, but only in form. In reality, it had become a negotiation with an unknown boundary no one could see. The lead investigator turned back to Hargrove. "What did you mean?" he said slowly. "By they're going to close it." Hargrove tilted his head slightly. Not evasive. Measuring. Like the question itself required calibration before it could be answered safely. Then, "Not close like you think," he said. A pause. Close like it never existed. Behind the glass, one analyst immediately pulled up archival municipal records, cross-checking permits, utility maps, and decommission logs from the excavation site and surrounding structures. Another checked federal infrastructure databases. A third accessed old utility company transfers from the early 2000s. What they found made the room go colder. There were documented transitions of control over multiple underground utility corridors in the area. But the records were inconsistent. Some sections listed ownership. Others showed redacted custodianship entries. And a few segments, entire blocks of underground infrastructure, had no recorded ownership at all. Not missing. Not lost. Absent from the chain entirely. As if responsibility had been deliberately distributed outside normal administrative systems. The forensic psychologist stepped closer to the glass. "This isn't just a crime scene," she said quietly. "This is layered jurisdictional blindness." Inside the interrogation room, the lead investigator pressed harder. "You're saying someone is actively erasing the excavation?" Hargrove didn't confirm. He didn't deny. Instead, he said, "They don't erase. They restore." That distinction landed like a blade. Restore suggested correction. Repair. Normalization of something previously disrupted. As if what investigators had uncovered was never meant to stay visible. And now it was being corrected. The interrogation room lights flickered again. Shorter this time. Almost polite. Like a warning that didn't need to escalate further to be understood. Outside, Chicago's dawn had fully arrived, but the light felt distant. The station windows reflected back too much interior darkness, too many faces locked in different stages of disbelief. Then something unexpected happened. A phone rang. Not the secure line. Not the monitored line. A landline in the corner office that had not been used in years. Everyone turned. No one answered immediately. The ringing continued with mechanical persistence, evenly spaced, unaffected by urgency or panic. Finally, one officer picked up. A brief pause. Then his face changed. He didn't speak. Just listened. Then slowly placed the receiver back down. "What is it?" the lead investigator asked. The officer hesitated. "City Utilities," he said. "They're reporting a full systems reset in the underground grid network for that district." A pause. "And they're saying it was initiated locally." Silence returned, heavier than before. Because locally meant within the very system they were standing on top of. Inside the interrogation room, Hargrove exhaled slowly for the first time in what felt like hours. Not relief. Not tension release. Confirmation. "They noticed you noticed," he said. The investigator stepped forward sharply. "Who noticed?" Hargrove finally looked directly at him, and answered with something that wasn't a name, but a classification. "The maintainers." The word hung in the room, unanchored to anything recognizable in standard investigative frameworks. It wasn't a suspect category. It wasn't a known organization. It wasn't even a criminal descriptor. It sounded procedural, institutional, like something that existed outside the language of law enforcement entirely. Behind the glass, the excavation team attempted a manual reconnection of one of the cut feeds. A technician bypassed protocol, rerouting a local line through a mobile transmitter brought in earlier for redundancy. For a moment, it worked. A shaky image returned. Not from the chamber. Not from the shaft. But from somewhere deeper. The feed showed a corridor that none of the maps had included. Narrow. Reinforced. Lit by intermittent strips of pale, aging light that flickered in inconsistent patterns. The camera moved forward slightly, either carried or mounted on a slowly advancing platform. Then it stopped, because something was visible at the far end. A door. Not industrial. Not mechanical. Reinforced. Sealed. And marked with symbols that didn't match any known municipal, federal, or industrial coding system in the United States infrastructure database. The technician zoomed in. One symbol resembled a crossed geometric pattern. Another looked like a segmented ring. Underneath, faint text appeared. Not English. Not Cyrillic. Not any recognizable modern script. Then the feed cut again. But this time, not abruptly. It faded, like something had deliberately reduced its visibility until it could no longer be observed. In the interrogation room, Hargrove spoke before anyone asked. "You weren't supposed to see that corridor," he said. The lead investigator's voice lowered. "Why?" A pause. Then, "Because that's where correction happens." For the first time since the case began, no one in the room responded immediately. Not because they didn't have questions, but because every possible question now felt like it belonged to a system they did not fully understand. And somewhere beneath Chicago, in spaces no longer represented on any official map, something had begun to move again, quietly, deliberately, responding not to discovery itself, but to the fact that discovery had been acknowledged. The word correction didn't leave the room. It stayed there, suspended in the air like a contaminant that refused to settle. Even after Hargrove stopped speaking, even after the monitors went dark again, even after the last attempt to reconnect the excavation feed failed, that single idea remained active in everyone's thinking. Not as interpretation anymore, but as intrusion. Correction implied authority. Not criminal authority. Not institutional authority as investigators understood it. Something older in structure. More procedural than emotional. Less interested in punishment than in alignment. Behind the glass, the interrogation team no longer spoke in full sentences. Everything had shortened. Commands replaced questions. Observations replaced theories. As if language itself was being compressed under pressure. The lead investigator finally broke the silence. "Explain it," he said. Hargrove didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the table. At the scratches in the metal surface. At the faint reflections of overhead lights bending across old imperfections. Then he said, "You think you found a hidden place." A pause. "But you found a boundary." That distinction changed the temperature of the room again. Hidden places could be searched. Boundaries could only be crossed. Or enforced. Behind the glass, the forensic systems team reported that all recovered underground signal data had begun to degrade in storage. Not corruption in the conventional sense. Not data loss. The files were still intact, but their structure no longer matched expected formats. Metadata fields were rearranging themselves into unreadable configurations. One technician described it as like the recordings are reorganizing themselves. No one corrected him, because no one had a better explanation. Outside, Chicago's morning traffic continued as if nothing had changed. Cars moved through intersections. Pedestrians crossed streets with coffee cups and headphones. Delivery trucks passed construction zones. The surface world remained entirely unaware that beneath it, something had reasserted control over its own visibility. Back inside the station, an urgent update arrived from the excavation perimeter. The site had been physically sealed. Not by police. Not by emergency protocol. By structural collapse. Every access point to the underground chamber had been blocked simultaneously. Not gradually. Not due to instability. Reports confirmed that multiple reinforced sections had failed at the same moment, as if load-bearing systems had been intentionally disengaged from within. One engineer whispered, "That's not a collapse pattern." He didn't finish the sentence, because everyone already understood what he meant. It was containment. Re-established containment. Inside the interrogation room, the lead investigator stepped closer to Hargrove. "You said they." A pause. "Are you saying you're not alone in this?" Hargrove finally looked up, and for the first time, there was something like exhaustion behind his eyes. Not physical exhaustion. Structural. As if maintaining a consistent narrative had become increasingly difficult. "I was never alone," he said quietly. The words didn't land as confession. They landed as correction of a misunderstanding that had persisted too long. Behind the glass, analysts immediately flagged the statement. One began listing every known associate connected to Hargrove's employment history. Another cross-referenced communications logs, financial records, and archived surveillance. But the psychologist stopped them with a raised hand. "No," she said. "He's not talking about people in the way we define people." That sentence wasn't comforting. It was worse than anything else said so far, because it implied the category itself might be wrong. The interrogation shifted again. "Then what are they?" the lead investigator asked. Hargrove hesitated, longer than before. When he spoke, his voice was lower. Maintenance. A pause. Correction. Maintenance. Continuity. Each word landed separately, like components of a system being assembled in real time. Behind the glass, one analyst quietly wrote, "Functional descriptors, not identities." The implication spread immediately through the room. These were roles. Not names. Not individuals. Roles that could be filled, or triggered, or activated. At that exact moment, a new alert appeared on every internal terminal. Unauthorized structural response detected. All external mapping invalidated. Do not trust current geospatial data. The message repeated 3 times, then vanished. No system log recorded its origin. The lead investigator turned sharply toward the control team. Where did that come from? No one answered immediately, because every system they checked returned the same result. No registrase. No sender. No pasgua. As if the message had been generated inside the network itself without entering it. Then the lights in the interrogation room dimmed again. Not flickering. Not failing. Dimming. Controlled reduction. Like something regulating observation conditions. Hargrove looked up at the ceiling and said, "They're reducing visibility." The investigator slammed his hand on the table. "Who is they?" This time, Hargrove answered immediately. "The ones who keep it stable." A pause. "You were never supposed to map it." Behind the glass, the excavation team's last recovered images were re-examined frame by frame. One analyst noticed something previously dismissed as artifact distortion. A faint structural outline beneath the corridor feed. Not static architecture, but shifting geometry, subtle changes in shape between frames, as if the space itself was not fixed. The analyst zoomed in, paused, then said softly, "It's not just underground." Everyone turned. He continued, "It extends vertically." The room went still again. Vertically meant layers. Not just depth. Stratification. Stacked systems. And if that was true, then the excavation hadn't uncovered a site. It had intersected a level. Inside the interrogation room, Hargrove leaned forward slightly. "You're close," he said. The lead investigator narrowed his eyes. "Close to what?" Hargrove paused. Then carefully. "To being noticed correctly." That phrase shifted everything again. Not noticed. Not observed. Noticed correctly. As if observation itself had rules. And those rules had just been broken. At that exact moment, every electronic device in the station simultaneously displayed a brief image. Not a message. Not a warning. An image. A single frame. A dim corridor. A door marked with unfamiliar symbols. And beneath it a timestamp. Alignment initiated. Then everything returned to normal. Or at least appeared to. Because nothing in the room felt normal anymore. And Hargrove, still seated calmly at the center of it all, finally added one last sentence before the next silence took hold. "Now you understand why Angela Mercer was only the beginning of the mistake." The phrase, "the beginning of the mistake," didn't provoke a reaction anymore. It didn't shock the room. It didn't escalate tension. It simply added another layer to something already too heavy to carry in a straight line of thought. By this point, the interrogation had stopped behaving like an interrogation. It had become a containment of perspective. Everyone trying to hold on to a version of reality that was still compatible with police work, forensic science, and procedural logic, while everything they had uncovered kept drifting just slightly outside those definitions. The lead investigator no longer paced. He stood still, staring at Hargrove as if movement itself might disrupt the fragile balance of understanding. "Start from the top," he said quietly. "No riddles. No terms. Just what happened to Angela Mercer." Hargrove didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched longer than usual. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the earlier sharp certainty. Not weaker, compressed, as if fewer words were now available to describe the same reality. "She didn't enter it as a victim," he said. A pause. "She entered it as an interruption." Behind the glass, the forensic psychologist immediately wrote that down. Interruption. That word carried structural meaning. It implied process already in motion. Something ongoing before contact. The lead investigator leaned forward. "Explain." Hargrove looked at him, and for the first time, there was no smile, no composure that felt performative. Just something closer to fatigue. There are patterns that run under the city, he said. Not tunnels. Not systems you build and forget. Patterns that maintain continuity between places people think are separate. He paused, as if checking whether the language still matched what he meant. Angela crossed one without knowing it. The room went quiet again, but differently now. Less confrontation, more absorption. Even skepticism was starting to lose its shape. Behind the glass, analysts pulled up every geospatial overlay of Chicago they had, including utility corridors, abandoned rail spurs, old freight zoning maps, and decommissioned industrial networks. Layer after layer appeared on screen, stacked, rotated, compared. And something unsettling began to emerge. Not a single network. Multiple overlapping grids. Some official. Some historical. Some partially undocumented. And some that didn't correspond to any known civil infrastructure model at all. One analyst whispered, almost unconsciously, this shouldn't align. But it did. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to suggest intentional design rather than coincidence. Inside the interrogation room, the lead investigator pressed again. So she crossed a pattern, he said. And what? That triggered what? Abduction? Murder? All of this? Hargrove shook his head once. No, he said. A pause. She triggered attention. That word again. Attention. Not targeting. Not selection. Attention. As if the system had been passive until something crossed a threshold of notice. The investigator's voice tightened. Attention from who? Hargrove looked at the table again. When he spoke, it was almost reluctant. From what maintains the pattern. Behind the glass, the forensic psychologist exhaled slowly. This is perception architecture, she said quietly. He's describing a system that reacts to observation as input. No one responded, because no one wanted to translate that idea further. At that moment, a new update arrived from City Infrastructure Monitoring Systems. Unexpected, unrequested, displayed across multiple terminals simultaneously. Subterranean network stability restored. Unauthorized observation events logged. Localized correction complete. The wording caused immediate confusion. Correction complete implied action had already occurred. Not in progress. Not pending. Finished. But nothing visible had changed on the surface. No structural collapse reports. No emergency alerts. No municipal notifications. Just that message. And the absence of everything that had been active moments before. The lead investigator turned toward the control room. Who authorized that message? No one answered. Because every system log showed the same thing. No origin. No administrative trigger. No identifiable sender. It was as if the infrastructure itself had generated the notification to confirm its own adjustment. Inside the interrogation room, the lights dimmed again, but this time they didn't stabilize afterward. They remained slightly lower than before. Permanent réduction. Hargrove noticed. So did everyone else. He leaned back slightly. They're settling it, he said. The investigator's patience finally broke. Settling what? Hargrove looked at him and answered simply. What you woke up. Behind the glass, one technician suddenly called out. Wait, look at the archive feed. They pulled up the earliest excavation recordings again, the ones saved locally before the system blackout. As they opened the files, something immediately stood out. Metadata had changed. Not content. Metadata. Timestamps had shifted by seconds. File origin tags had been rewritten. Some entries now showed restored classification instead of discovered. One file, originally labeled Basement Entry A, now read Baseline Access Point. Another originally tagged as Unidentified Structure, now displayed Maintenance Node, Inactive Status. The system wasn't just correcting external perception. It was rewriting internal classification. Retroactively. The forensic psychologist stepped back from the monitor. It's reclassifying our interpretation layer, she said. It's correcting our records. The lead investigator turned sharply. That's impossible. But even as he said it, another file updated in real time. Then another. Then 5 more in sequence. Inside the interrogation room, Hargrove watched the same phenomenon unfold on the monitors. And nodded slightly. That's faster than I expected, he said. The investigator stepped forward again. Faster than what? Hargrove didn't answer immediately. Then, containment response. A pause. You don't get to keep everything you see. Behind the glass, alarms did not sound. No siren saktevatid. Instead, something more unsettling happened. All external communication lines to the station displayed a single uniform status. Linked. No errors. No warnings. Just connected. Then, for the first time since the excavation collapse, audio returned briefly. Not from underground. From the station itself. A faint sound in the background of every open channel. A synchronized hum. Structured. Rhythmic. Like something large had just begun operating again, not beneath the city, but through it. And Hargrove, still seated calmly in the center of the interrogation room, finally spoke one last line before the next silence arrived. It never stopped, he said. It just waited for you to align it again. The hum didn't fade this time. It stabilized. Not louder. Not softer. Just consistent, as if the station itself had quietly synchronized to a frequency nobody had agreed to hear, but everyone was now forced to tolerate. Every monitor in the building displayed the same status. Linked. No explanation. No origin. No override option that didn't immediately fail. And the most disturbing part wasn't the message itself. It was how quickly everyone stopped expecting it to change. Inside the interrogation room, the lead investigator finally stepped back from the table. Not retreating, exactly, recalibrating distance. Like proximity to Hargrove had become a variable in something unstable. You're saying, he began slowly, that everything we've seen, the chamber, the tapes, the underground network reacts to observation? Hargrove didn't correct him. He didn't agree either. He simply said, it reacts to resolution. The word hung in the air. Resolution. In forensic terms, it meant clarity, completion, a case closed, an image sharpened into certainty. But here, it sounded like something else entirely. Behind the glass, analysts were no longer working in parallel. They were converging on a single point of confusion. Every dataset related to the excavation site was continuing to update itself, even after the physical systems were disconnected. Maps redrew their own boundaries. Logs reclassified their own entries. Even earlier forensic notes, handwritten, scanned, archived, now had digital annotations appended without human input. One technician whispered, it's standardizing interpretation. No one disagreed, because that's exactly what it looked like. Something was forcing consistency onto fragmented understanding. And it wasn't asking permission. Outside, Chicago remained unchanged in appearance. Cars still moved. People still waited for buses. Construction crews still worked above ground on projects that had no awareness of what lay beneath them. But beneath that surface normalcy, something had shifted in how systems behaved. Traffic signals in a 3-block radius adjusted timing without municipal input. Utility sensors recalibrated baseline thresholds. Emergency alert systems briefly entered diagnostic mode, then exited without explanation. Everything was behaving as if it had been reminded of a configuration it had temporarily forgotten. Back in the interrogation room, the psychologist finally stepped inside. A rare procedural breach. She didn't sit. She stood near the edge of the table, looking directly at Hargrove. You're describing a system that changes based on awareness, she said carefully. But that requires intent. Who designed it? For the first time, Hargrove hesitated. Not long, but noticeably longer than before. When he answered, his voice had a different quality. Less declarative. More constrained. Design is the wrong word, he said. A pause. It grew through correction. The investigator interjected immediately. Correction of what? Hargrove looked at him. Errors. Behind the glass, one analyst immediately flagged a contradiction. If this is correction-based, then there must be a reference model, he said. A stable baseline state it's trying to achieve. The psychologist responded without looking away from Hargrove. Or it defines baseline through elimination of deviation. That sentence changed the tone of the entire room again. Because elimination didn't imply adjustment. It implied removal. At that exact moment, the system-wide linked status flickered for the first time. Not a failure. A variation. For half a second, the text changed to unlinking, then immediately reverted. But that half second was enough. Every monitor captured it. Every system log recorded it. And none of them could agree afterward whether it had actually happened or whether it had been introduced retroactively into the record. Inside the interrogation room, Hargrove noticed the flicker. He exhaled slowly. That's not supposed to happen yet, he said. The investigator snapped. What isn't supposed to happen? Hargrove looked at him directly. The correction being observed while it's still stabilizing. Behind the glass, alarms finally triggered, but not standard alarms. Internal system alerts. Not audible. Visual only. Every screen displayed the same message. Stabilization phase compromised. Observation rate exceeds containment threshold. Immediate reduction recommended. No one needed to ask what reduction meant anymore. They were beginning to understand it wasn't procedural language. It was operational intent. At the excavation site, or what remained of its digital presence, one backup system briefly reconnected before failing again. In that short window, a final fragment of data was transmitted. Not audio, not video, a structural map, but incomplete, because parts of it were actively disappearing as it was being viewed. Nodes labeled as active were changing to inactive. Corridors were collapsing into blank space. Entire sections of the underground network were being replaced with neutral geometry, as if they had never contained anything at all. The map wasn't being edited. It was being simplified. Inside the interrogation room, the psychologist stepped closer to the table. "Daniel," she said quietly, "what happens if the system fully stabilizes?" Hargrove didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost its earlier certainty entirely. "Then it stops reacting," he said. A pause. "And starts deciding." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Functional silence. The kind that occurs when everyone in the room realizes they are no longer evaluating an event, but a transition. The investigator spoke carefully. Deciding what? Hargrove looked at the monitors again. At the linked status. At the flickering systems. At the slow, visible restructuring of everything they had tried to capture. And he said, "What gets remembered?" Behind the glass, one final system alert appeared across all interfaces. No further observation permitted during stabilization. All external feeds to excavation history were instantly restricted. Not deleted. Not corrupted. Restricted. As if access itself had been reassigned. And then, without warning, the interrogation room doors locked automatically. No manual override response. No mechanical delay. Just immediate containment protocol. The lead investigator turned sharply toward the control room. What just triggered that? No one answered. Because the system logs had already rewritten the event classification. It was no longer labeled as lockdown. It was labeled as final alignment initiated. And in the center of it all, Daniel Hargrove sat quietly, watching the room settle into a new state of order.